Well, I was going to ask you all what your favorite Western is, because I'm actually kind of genuinely interested in that. Do you have a favorite Western, since we're talking sheriffs today on the show?
I just rewatched Lonesome Dove in honor of Robert Duvall.
Oh, R.I.P. I've never watched that, but it keeps coming up on my recommended now. My favorite is a really, really schlocky 90s early aughts movie called Tombstone.
Oh, yeah.
Starring
I'm
a young
Huckleberry.
Exactly. Starring a young Val Kilmer. I'm your Huckleberry. What about you, Kat?
I love Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The bad is so hot.
I think it's time for Sound Politics.
I'm sorry.
You're listening to Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Kat Smith, in for Libby Dankman. Scott, we are going to talk today about one of the most dramatic storylines of the legislative session this year, and it's not the millionaire's tax.
This is because I threw a fit and said, we can't keep talking about the millionaire's tax.
We've been covering it a lot. But
I know, we have.
There's a lot
important.
of drama in Olympia that's not the millionaire's tax.
Drama is the word. You may have seen recent headlines about, Washington sheriffs skirting, maybe scoffing at state law to try to work with the feds on immigration. These are especially sheriffs in more, Republican places in Washington. Now, if a sheriff breaks the law, normally the voters are usually the only ones who can remove them from office, right? Because in most of the state, they're elected. Unless this bill we're going to talk about today passes. And as you might imagine, it has sheriffs and police all over the state divided. Many are concerned.
And I think the most concerned are freaking out. Like we saw that tension on display in Olympia recently.
Oh, yeah.
Scott,
definitely.
Set the scene for us.
Right.
Take us there.
So we're going to go to a state Senate Law and Justice Committee meeting in January. And before your eyes start to roll back in your head.
They are rolling back in my head.
No. don't let them. This is a spicy one.
Oh, good.
This is, you may recognize this name, Pierce County Sheriff Keith Swank. We have talked about him on the podcast before. Here he is.
I don't recognize your authority to impose these controls over me. And when you try to remove me from office, thousands of Pierce County residents will surround the county city building in downtown Tacoma and will not allow that to happen. I hope it doesn't come to that, but I and they are prepared. Are you prepared?
Yeah, so Swank is voicing his opposition to this reform bill we mentioned earlier. But lawmakers felt like he was threatening them with violence.
Yeah, this is not the kind of language you typically hear in a public hearing for a bill. And there was a considerable amount of backlash to Swank's rhetoric here, not just from lawmakers, but from cops, too. And if you know anything about Sheriff Swank, you know this is kind of normal for him. He tends to court controversy.
Yeah, right. So he's a Trump supporter who won a surprise, I think, election in 2024 in Pierce County. He said his officers, he wants them to work with ICE in immigration enforcement, bucking state sanctuary policies like the Keep Washington Working Act, which prohibits this. He has posted online about getting out the handcuffs to arrest Governor Ferguson, things like that.
He even he accused a host on Cairo Radio of having Swank derangement syndrome when she brought up his 2007 DUI arrest in an interview. Wow. So Swank, I think it's safe to say he's out of step with most state officials in Western Washington, but he was also elected.
Yeah.
He was elected by the residents of Pierce County. And in that clip we just played, he's testifying against the bill that could potentially end his tenure in office against the will of the people who elected him. And here's more from that testimony.
You want to give unelected bureaucracy the ability to decertify me and remove me from office because you don't agree with my speech.
And this brings us back to the reforms outlined in this bill, because while Swank is very distracting, today, I think the story we want to talk about is bigger than him. The big question here is whether this new bill would allow Democrats in Olympia to essentially undo the will of voters who elect their sheriffs to make it easier for elected sheriffs to effectively get tossed out of office.
And we're going to talk about all of this with KUOW's Amy Radil after a quick break.
We are back with Sound Politics, and we're here with KUOW's Amy Radil, who is following this controversial, maybe, bill moving through Olympia about who can lead law enforcement agencies and who can remove them, right? Who watches the watchers type business. Hi, Amy. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So tell us first, what kind of reforms this? There's a lot in this bill, right, that is not removing elected sheriffs. There's a lot of other things. What reforms would this bill aim to create?
Yeah, it also kind of just sets who can run for sheriff and who can be appointed chief of police. So some new eligibility requirements at the front end. There isn't going to be a new age requirement. You have to be 25 at least.
Oh, okay.
You have to have at least 5 years experience in law enforcement. Different things about you can't serve if you have any, kinds of misconduct or convictions in your background. Things that people might have thought already were in place, but actually this hasn't been spelled out until now.
Interesting.
And we've been talking, Scott and I have been talking about the decertification process for basically kicking out an elected sheriff. That is the central tension in this bill here. Can you walk us through the decertification process for a sheriff? What does the current law say, and how would this bill change that?
Yeah, and so just to be clear, this process exists for all members of law enforcement, and this bill is just kind of spelling out, okay, if you're a sheriff, how exactly would this apply to you? But it's not a special process for them. It's, certification is your license to be a law enforcement officer, and everyone, has to have this, and it's granted by a state agency. It's called the Criminal Justice Training Commission, and those commissioners are appointed by the governor, and they oversee the police academy. There's one in Burien and around the state.
So right now, if you're a sheriff, you don't have to be certified by them technically?
You do.
You do.
Yeah.
But they can't remove you from office.
Yeah, we're kind of spelling out what happens when you have to have this certification taken away for some kind of a cause. This process has always existed, but it was very cumbersome. It was very rare. And so our state in the last few years, think of this as the agenda kind of coming out of protests in 2020. They put a lot of work into making decertification more transparent, keeping people with troubled histories from moving from place to place, police officers.
Police officers with misconduct. Okay.
Exactly. So they kind of they spelled it out more how this is going to work. The public can file complaints alleging misconduct against any member of law enforcement. And then the commission determines whether it has any kind of merit, whether to investigate. Ultimately, there might be a hearing before an administrative law judge, So we've been using this process, but our current law doesn't really spell out, okay, what happens if the sitting sheriff is the person who this process involves,
If he gets decertified, what happens to his elected position?
Exactly. The backers of this bill really want to make that clear. They're worried that if a sheriff gets decertified, that person will just stay on the job, and kind of keep the privileges and their access to everything that they have in that work, even though they've lost their license to be a law enforcement officer.
But there's nothing in the law currently that says you are now decertified, you must vacate this office.
Exactly. So they might just stay. So this bill says if the sheriff is decertified, technically your position becomes vacant and your county follows whatever process they normally use to appoint a replacement for you.
We started by talking about the Keith Swank of it all. He's obviously buzzy, but his comments were controversial, right? This vision of Pierce County residents surrounding the courthouse to save him from being removed from office. I don't really know. But to get away from him for a second, many sheriffs do, even if they disagree with the way he voiced it, they share his concerns. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that I haven't heard of any sheriff who supports this bill, any sitting sheriff. So, so Swank is part of maybe a smaller group of sheriffs where, he's saying he doesn't recognize the authority of legislators to pass laws that would constrain elected sheriffs. That's a hallmark of the constitutional sheriff movement. They push that idea that sheriffs are sovereign and they only answer to voters and they aren't obligated to enforce laws that they deem are unjust.
They even believe that they're above the president and Congress.
Yeah, so
like they can interpret the U.S. Constitution.
Exactly. So that's a movement, and we know that a small group of sheriffs in our state are supporters of that idea. I talked to Hugh Spitzer, and he's a retired UW law professor. He's an expert in the Washington state constitution. He says this idea is completely unfounded in our state. In Washington state, he says legislators do have the power to set eligibility requirements for other elected candidates. We have a process to remove elected judges. Those are elected officials, and they can be disbarred by the Bar Association, kind of an administrative process. It can be reviewed by the Supreme Court, but he used that just as one example to say sheriffs don't have this special status that people like Keith Swank claim they have.
But so the constitutional sheriffs they're a fringe group, but you mentioned that no sitting sheriffs support this bill.
That I'm aware of.
Yeah.
And so this bill is, more broadly, there are people who certainly do not embrace that constitutional sheriff movement, but they oppose this bill. Almost all of our sheriffs are elected. Only the King County Sheriff is appointed right now.
I forget that.
I spoke with Ryan Sperling. He's the sheriff in Mason County, northwest of Olympia. And one reason that I contacted him is he currently serves on the Criminal Justice Training Commission, this unelected board that people have been talking about in this debate. It's a mix of law enforcement and majority civilian now. So Sheriff Sperling is seeing this process up close. And he says, the officers who have already been decertified recently in Washington state, he agrees with those decisions. He says those people should not have been working in law enforcement. But Sheriff Sperling said when it comes to elected sheriffs, he already sees people filing complaints with the state agency for what he thinks are political reasons.
They're getting a lot of them, especially if somebody is dissatisfied with something. They'll make a complaint. I know of a sheriff during the last election. His opponents made complaints against him that were erroneous, but they weaponized it during the campaign.
And what Sheriff Sperling said he's really concerned about, he said most of the reasons for decertification are very straightforward. But there is a provision in state law that they may decertify someone for speech, for postings that could be seen as prejudicial or discriminatory. And that's the main area where he is worried that could really conflict with the ability for sheriffs to criticize laws, speak their minds, and, talk about issues in their communities. So he said sheriffs can't break state law, but they should be able to criticize them.
If a sheriff, an example, in Klickitat County feels like his constituency feels like they should work with ICE, and that's what his county wants him to say as an elected, shouldn't he be able to say that? The question is, the moment he breaks a law, he should be removed. I agree with that. But shouldn't he be able to say what he wants to say without being removed?
I see. So the argument there being essentially that people are already filing complaints with this board for political reasons. If this board can actually do something about it, can actually remove them for speech, that's a huge problem, removing an elected official for speech. Is that what he's arguing?
Yeah, and so Sheriff Sperling there was talking about the Klickitat County Sheriff Bob Songer, who made a video saying he wants ICE to have his agency on speed dial. He wants to, he was reflecting this idea that he wants to help with immigration enforcement. Sheriff Sperling said you can't break state law, but you should be able to kind of talk about things
without fear of reprisal.
Yes,
Classic
exactly.
First Amendment stuff.
Yeah, and Sheriff Sperling supported an alternative in the legislature where if they decertified a sheriff, that would trigger an automatic recall. So it would allow sheriffs to be decertified, but it would still then require the vote by their constituents to actually remove them from office.
And that alternative did not move forward, right?
Right.
This bill does not include that recall.
Right.
Since we're talking about Bob Songer, I do want to ask you about the posse section of this bill, because that applies to something that Bob Songer is kind of known for. Basically, this is a restriction on volunteers doing certain types of police work. And in Klickitat County, Songer is kind of known for having this posse of volunteers who ride around on horseback with him, helping him with his duties. It's a very cinematic image that it conjures. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about these new rules around volunteers that are outlined in this bill. Amy, can you kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, that's kind of a whole other section of what this bill would do is it proposes rules against volunteers doing any type of criminal, actual law enforcement. So it says volunteers can't do pursuits. They can't use force. They can't do civil immigration enforcement. The bill says because if something goes wrong, there's no accountability process for these people. They haven't been trained and certified. It says agencies should use volunteers for things like search and rescue, crime prevention, efforts like that. But then the opponents say these volunteers are a huge help with their budget in smaller agencies and rural areas. They don't want to lose that resource. I looked up Sheriff Songer's posse on their website. It looks like they mostly assist with public events. It's not clear how much their actual day-to-day role would have to change if this passes. But this would, kind of put some overarching restrictions on what these volunteers are doing.
Yeah, no deputizing the populace if this passes, it seems like. Amy, you've been so deep in this bill. Are there surprises in terms of like who supports it or who opposes it?
Yeah, I thought there was one. So the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, kind of the big law enforcement lobbyist organization, strongly opposes this bill.
Okay, no surprise there.
Yeah, and they did say they protested against Sheriff Swank's comments, and they may expel him from the organization. So they definitely condemned his rhetoric, but they also are part of the broad law enforcement community that opposes this bill, and sees it as an assault on the powers of elected sheriffs. But the other main law enforcement group that you see in Olympia is WACOPS. It's a labor-oriented group made up of the police officer guilds, and this group supports the bill. They say,
interesting.
Yeah, because they represent rank and file officers, and they said those officers want their leaders to follow the same rules that they do, to face the same kind of discipline and oversight. And so they told lawmakers few things erode trust more than a leader who is not held to account.
Wow.
That is fascinating.
Amy, do other states treat sheriffs the way this bill wants to treat them? Like how much of an outlier is this bill?
No, it's been part of a national conversation. There's definitely been very similar efforts, popping up in states, and the political dynamics have really varied. They're not the same landscape we've seen here necessarily. In Texas 2 years ago, they imposed a new certification requirement for sheriffs. They kind of said, we're kind of surprised that sheriffs weren't required to be certified. In that case, their effort was authored by a Republican lawmaker. I'm not aware of any Republican supporters here. Yeah.
Was there a big brouhaha over that bill in Texas? Like
there
is
wasn't,
here?
And I don't know if it was like the timing of who was in the different administrations. It was supported by the Deputy Sheriff's Association there too, and that group said it's not like we're in the 1800s in Texas where you just had to be good with a gun. You really have to know the law.
Amazing.
So in some places, this has been seen as pretty bipartisan, pretty like obvious changes and upgrades to how we choose leaders in law enforcement. Georgia had a similar initiative that was led by the Sheriff's Association recently. So it helps. It's interesting context to look at how controversial it's been here and who supports and opposes it, because it hasn't been that way everywhere.
In the 1800s, it just being good with a gun never went poorly, I'm sure.
For anyone.
Exactly.
Amy, do you expect to see this bill on the governor's desk at the end of session, or what are you watching going forward before we wrap up here?
Yeah, it seems like it's moving along, expected to pass. They made a few changes. They grandfathered in some of the current sheriffs who are in office who don't meet some of these eligibility requirements. The Pacific County Sheriff currently, Daniel Garcia, did not have previous law enforcement experience. He's a military veteran. He could have lost his ability to seek re-election there, but they've amended it so these requirements just apply to future candidates.
Oh.
So there wouldn't necessarily be this like wave of sheriffs booted out of office
Yeah,
if this bill were to
there's
pass.
only a few who probably don't meet these requirements, but for those people, it's like you're in office, the voters have chosen you, you're good to stay. And then the opponents say, they would think there might be a court challenge to this bill. They're worried about unintended consequences. We have seen the legislature go back and forth on some of the police reforms, like police pursuits.
Right.
We've seen changes.
Rolled that one back after a year or two.
Yeah, the less lethal weapons had to be retooled. So, they said it's possible that we'll see that, if there are unintended consequences and problems, who knows, this could come back to the legislature again sometime.
Okay, so Amy, thank you for all that context. I feel like I understand this bill a lot better than I did yesterday. But we're going to ask you to stick around for a few more minutes because we're going to bring on another guest. And we actually want to get your read on this conversation as well.
Yeah, we heard from Sheriff Swank. Amy, you mentioned no sitting sheriff supports this bill.
That I've seen, yeah.
That you've seen. But some former sheriffs do, and we are going to speak to one. We're here now with the former Snohomish County Sheriff and current state senator, also one of the primary sponsors of this bill, Senator John Lovick. He represents the 44th District, which includes Mill Creek and Snohomish. Senator Lovick, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. I listen to your show occasionally. I hop up in the morning and turn KUOW on, and so it's a good program.
Hey,
appreciate being here.
Thank you very much.
We really appreciate you listening. So today we're talking about this piece of legislation that would create new eligibility requirements for elected sheriffs. And if this became law, elected sheriffs would have to be at least 25 years old and have 5 years of law enforcement experience, among other requirements. They'd need to go undergo background checks. You are a primary sponsor of this bill. You were also the Snohomish County Sheriff for 5 years. Why is this bill necessary?
Well, it's necessary because I believe we have not updated our standards for sheriff for almost 2 decades. Other states have updated theirs, the state of Georgia, the state of Texas, and other states, Tennessee. And it's time that we absolutely make sure that the community who elects a sheriff, they need to know that their sheriff is well-trained, competent, trustworthy, and he or she is held to the same level of accountability that they hold their officers to. And that's what this legislation is all about accountability.
So sheriffs across the state and organizations representing them are concerned that this law explicitly applies the decertification process, which does exist for all law enforcement officers. It applies it to elected sheriffs now. That process of decertification, it's overseen by a governor-appointed board. So there could be a potential for this non-elected board to decertify an elected sheriff. If a sheriff is decertified and tossed out of office, does that go against the will of the voters who elected them?
That's a great question. And I don't think it does. I think the voters who elected a sheriff, they absolutely want to know that if their sheriff is decertified, because there are objective standards that sheriff is decertified by the Criminal Justice Training Commission, the same commission that decertifies police officers, sergeants, lieutenants. If that sheriff is decertified, why should he or she remain in office? An officer who is decertified cannot remain in office. So the sheriff, the top law enforcement officer, should not remain in office.
Well,
and just so that you'll know, it's only for serious misconduct. I know there have been comments out there that a sheriff could be decertified or recalled for being unpopular. Just not true. There is an objective process that the Criminal Justice Training Center uses, and and I can tell you this, of the 39 sheriffs, I doubt if there's a single sheriff that's going to have to deal with this, but they will know that they will be held accountable.
Well, and I want to ask you about that, but the difference between a sheriff and a regular police officer is that a regular police officer is not elected. What about Republicans in Olympia proposed an alternative to this decertification process where a sheriff getting decertified would cause an automatic recall election, and instead your bill creates a vacancy. Can't voters be trusted to then decide if their sheriff gets decertified?
you have to know, and I know one sheriff was recalled in, I believe, Benton County. You have to know that that is a very, very tough and difficult process, and I would probably say a long process and very, very intimidating for citizens to be out there trying to collect signatures to recall a sheriff. I think this process will be a better process that we're pleased that it's going to make the process much fairer for everyone, I believe. Probably the last thing that we want is to have an unqualified, a decertified sheriff sitting in office. I know there were some
Mm.
amendments to say if he if she, or she is decertified, they can remain in office. That has to be the worst thing to do because if an officer is decertified, he or she will not remain in office. Why should we allow a leader? And leaders should lead by example.
That makes sense to me, but the recall argument here, you talked about voters gathering signatures. It doesn't sound like that would be the case. The recall would be automatically triggered if the sheriff was decertified. So I wonder
Yeah,
why. Yeah.
yeah, you make a good point there. It would be, but again, it's still a very, very difficult process, and we believe that this process would be a better process. And we're working on some of those things. You know, the way the bill, as you've probably read it, the way the bill left the Senate is not the exact bill that's in the House right now.
Mm.
Representative Roger Goodman has, I think, not totally, but I think he's lowered the temperature on a lot of things. For example, we had one where you had to have 5 years of experience. That impacts the Pacific County Sheriff. We're going to change that because that sheriff will not be able to run for re-election under the current legislation, but we've
Right.
changed that. So these things go through that process of amendments, and and believe it or not, a lot of sheriffs aren't saying this, and I can understand that, but I think there will be more support for this later on than most of the guys are admitting. I'm
Hmm.
feeling very good about it. You know, Sheriff Saunders here in Thurston County, he agrees with certain parts of the bill. I know Sheriff Tanksley up in Whatcom County, he wrote a memo, an op-ed that he agrees with certain parts of the legislation. So we are getting there.
Hmm.
I want to ask you, Senator, about another aspect of this bill about the restriction on sheriffs using volunteers for things like enforcing criminal laws or arresting people. The Association of Washington Cities says that some places need volunteers because of shrinking budgets. And I will add also that this bill does seem focused on extreme use cases in the state. And I'm thinking specifically of Klickitat Sheriff Bob Songer, who's deputized nearly 170 volunteers to take part in law enforcement action. People living in that county, at least those who spoke with reporters, have been concerned about potentially violent confrontations with non-trained, non-certified police volunteers. But there are 38 other county sheriffs in the state. Are you concerned that in legislating for outliers like Sheriff Songer, that you're maybe creating financial burdens for a lot of communities that that don't have the resources for, full staff?
Yeah, good question. So what we thought about with this is we put it in the perspective that if you have the ability to detain, arrest, and take a life, you should be well trained. And sometimes I don't know what all of the volunteers do, and maybe that's an area where we are working on those things. And I understand. I've listened to the conversation that it might create a financial burden on some of our leaders. But we want to make sure that these volunteers are well trained.
Before we go, I wonder if you could step back and give us a little bit of how you see this bill in the narrative of post 2020, post George Floyd. In King County, we no longer have an elected sheriff at all because voters decided to get rid of the elected sheriff in 2020 in the wake of George Floyd. Where do you see this bill fitting into that bigger narrative?
That is a great question. And what I always say, it's about trust in the process, trust in the office of sheriff. And that's all this is about. You know, law enforcement, I was in law enforcement for almost 4 decades, and there has just been an erosion
Mm.
of trust and accountability. And I believe that when we pass this legislation and it becomes law, it's going to maintain the integrity of the office, the integrity of the profession. And that's all we are looking for.
I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Senator Lovick. You represent Washington's 44th Legislative District. I know you know that. I'm just reminding our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for your interest in this topic.
I guess I'm still not really, it's not really crystallizing for me. You know, I keep going back to Senator Lovick said it's difficult. Obviously, a recall election is a difficult thing. However, this seems like an incredibly rare, thing. I'm not sure if we can point to any situation where a sitting sheriff has actually been decertified before. We're not totally sure on that, but it's certainly not happening all the time.
We do know it's very rare.
We do know it's very rare. So, yes, a recall election is difficult, but why not, just send the question back to the people?
That's an interesting thought, Scott.
I guess the question then is, sheriff elections are really, they can be very tough. There can be it can be sometimes employees of the sheriff running against their elected official. We've seen that in recent years, right? An employee at the sheriff's department, a deputy running against their boss, and it can get a little bit nasty. I read about sheriffs who lost re-election countrywide, making it tougher. There's numerous instances of them leaving office and making it tougher for their successor, like on purpose trying to sabotage their successor. So these things can get very nasty, obviously.
Listening to you talk, I kind of have a new appreciation for why someone might think it's anti-democratic, for a bunch of maybe lefty eggheads in Olympia to make it easier to kick out a far-right sheriff who was elected by voters in a more rural, more Republican area. I do get how someone might look at that scenario,
Right.
the possibility of that, and think this doesn't look fair to me.
That might be why the speech thing is the Sperling's
Could
worry
be, yeah.
about the speech question.
And I don't think I quite got that until we started talking about it. Once you start diving into the bill, though, I feel like, I kind of realized that sheriffs have occupied this strange sort of privileged position where some of these lesser known facets of the law didn't really apply to them. And that's a little bit weird to me. I think the test moving forward is to watch out for incidents of bias in how sheriffs are considered for decertification, whether that process remains politically neutral or if it does seem to fall more heavily on some of these more Trump-aligned sheriffs in the state that we've been talking about. And another thing is I think the timing of this bill is interesting as we're looking ahead to the midterm elections. And we've been talking about these edge cases, this small group of constitutional sheriffs in the state. They think very differently politically than most of the elected officials in our state, especially in Western Washington. And the constitutional sheriffs, if you remember, that group thought that the 2020 election was stolen.
Yeah.
And there were concerns that they might interfere in elections moving forward. And I do wonder, I haven't heard this, but I wonder if that is part of the concern in the timing of this bill coming up when it is moving into the midterms this fall. I'm curious if lawmakers in Olympia thought about that as this is a time to rein in some of these guys. I haven't heard that, though.
Yeah, I think for the supporters, it's more like they have been putting things in place, building blocks in place since 2020. First really being clear about the tactics and the force and the stuff that police officers, frontline officers can do. And for them, this is like the end of the, towards the end of the arc where it's like now we're finally scaffolding up to the leadership that just their roles haven't really been subject to these same kinds of accountability provisions. So
that timing is more of a coincidence.
Yeah, so I don't think it's, even coming out of like the
well, then I'll just take off my tinfoil hat. Thank you, Amy.
No, yeah. No, but I do think that the rhetoric of the constitutional sheriffs has been a concern, for the people developing these proposals, for people to say, I'm not going to follow a voter passed initiative.
Yeah.
I'm not going to enforce a state law. I do think that's been a concern.
Because my voters elected me and my voters
don't agree with that.
God, even if I ran unopposed, which many sheriffs do, or something like that. It's a really fascinating. I think the office to me is one of the most fascinating elected offices because it is, I believe, from what I have read, the oldest elected position in much of America.
Oh,
White
cool.
settlers started electing sheriffs in the 1600s before the United States even existed. And here in the West, in many regions, the elected sheriff was the first official in the county or in the territory. And I think that's really interesting. But that's a massive zoom out right here at the end. Amy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
That's all the time we have for Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone. Our producer is Hans Anderson. Our editor is Cat Smith.
Also
our
sometimes
co-host.
And this show is only possible because of your support, the listener. So please consider a donation at kuow.org/politics, and we will see you next week.